Hi all, I'm Gabriela Houston. Welcome to my show where we talk about storytelling in all its forms. On the show, I talk to artists, journalists, researchers, other writers, of course, and more about how they use storytelling in their jobs and life. So today's guest is R.W.W. Greene. He is a New Hampshire-based American writer. He's a frequent panelist at the Boskone science fiction and fantasy conventions in Boston, and his work has been in Stupefying Stories, daily science fiction, new myths, and more. And most importantly, he's the author of 4 science fiction novels, most recently of the First Planet's duology, Mercury Rising and Earth Retrograde, both out now from Angry Robot Books. So thank you so much for coming, Rob.
Well, thanks very much for having me, Gabriella. It's good to see you.
So first of all, I wanted you to sort of tell us a little bit about your First Planet's duology, because that's for your most recent books.
Sure. The First Planet's duology is, I call it an alternate history because it starts in, the story kind of starts in 1950 when Robert Oppenheimer, instead of inventing a bomb, invents an engine and kind of makes our space race much quicker. We get to Mars and the moon and that kind of stuff much quicker. But in 1961, aliens invade, maybe, and they're fended off by combined forces of the Soviet Union and the United States. The book starts in 1976, alternate 1976, and people are starting to wonder whether the aliens are real or if Nixon invented them to get reelected.
So, starting off with like alternative history, they're like alternative history whole abiding popularity in books and TV shows like Man in High Castle. Like, what first attracted you to that? Because before you did like more straightforward science fiction, and here you're going a bit historical. So, what made you go in this direction?
I think it started right after the United States shut down its space shuttle program. I was kind of like, the whole idea of like not having a way to get into space and the end of like manned missions and this kind of stuff. And I was a little cranky about that. So I wrote a short story kind of retelling the Apollo 1 disaster, which is when Gus Grissom and Ed White and Roger Chaffee died on the launch pad. So I rewrote that in kind of an alternate history where they had this pariah victory over aliens instead. And as I finished that, I started thinking about, all right, so what would happen next? And what would happen next is what the book grew from, I guess, as I started thinking about, like 8 tracks as a computer storage medium and, disco in space and that kind of 70s style and what that might look like if we had made it to the moon at that time. So it just kind of grew from there.
I mean, that time period that you sort of went with, and there's like a little shot of a kind of 1950s sort of at the beginning of the duology, and then we jump to sort of 20 odd years to the future, and that time period has, I feel like, almost fairy tale like status in people's minds, especially in the States. And you have the March on Washington, you have the Kennedy assassination, and then there's this period of Cold War and then this sort of cultural change, cultural shift in the 60s and 70s, and the sudden sort of anti-war sentiment sort of creeping in, that wasn't really there before. So how did you sort of use that in your book?
I think I used all of it because the 70s to me, I like your idea that it's kind of a fantasy land, but the 70s to me, I was born in 71. So it's always kind of like been like, I don't know, in my head somewhere. It's just kind of like golden time.
So 30 years ago.
Yeah, 30 years ago. Yep. So, but it seems like the 70s were a time where we could have gotten things a lot more right than we did. Like there were a lot of like social movements going on. The first Earth Day was in 1971. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, was launched here in America about that time. Even Richard Nixon, when he was first came to office, he had this idea for universal basic income and a universal health plan. But the real right-wing Republicans talked him out of it because they said it was too communist. So, so even Nixon was thinking about, a more broader social safety net and a more, leveling the playing field for people.
I mean, I didn't even know that. I mean, as someone sort of who grew up in Europe, I didn't know that because obviously the things that we know is about how like the high cost of medication in the States is Nixon's fault, and things like that. So I didn't know about those kind of more welfare state leanings that you mentioned.
Yeah, he came in with some very good intentions, and then it's like Pat Buchanan is the big bad evil at that time with the moral majority he was talking about, and just saying that it was far too socialist, far too communist for our country, and that instead we had to do all these other things. So if history had been just a little bit different, America might be in a much different place than it is now.
Yeah, it's like the kind of the butterfly effect, isn't it? And I was looking at those two sort of at the beginning of Mercury rising. You have this juxtaposition of atmosphere, I found. So you have this kind of 1950s, and it feels when we talk about kind of fairy tale like status of a time period, it felt very idealized. So you have this, obviously there's the Cold War element, but you have this character Jet, who's a pilot, and he is clearly extremely devoted to his wife, and he's a good pal, and he's just sort of sentimental about his airship, and everything is kind of has this sort of haze lens on it, I feel. And then we jump to the sort of 70s, and the character Brooklyn is, well, something else. So what made you go for that contrast? Did you do it consciously?
Yeah, I was trying to play with the idea that the first chapter there is actually kind of the novelization of a movie that Brooklyn had just watched. So at the beginning of the chapter 2, it's 1976, and Brooklyn and his pal are talking about the movie. And the movie is the kind of the dramatization of the actual conflict. And as such, there's a lot of Vaseline on the lens. It's very kind of like they've added some characters, they've taken away characters, they've changed things, they've made it a lot more starry-eyed than it really was. And so in that book, I'm trying to play with, in the series, the duology, I'm trying to play with kind of like notions of reality, in terms of like, this is one perspective, but the real thing is this, but maybe it's not. And, maybe the aliens are not what we think they are, and maybe they are, but maybe it's really the bad guys are really us. So I want to keep kind of people thinking and guessing and not really being sure where they're going to end up until the very end of the two books.
Yeah, I mean, I think you do that kind of switch very, very well. And I was also thinking about how in the first sort of chapter you have this, the story is that the Russians are a little bit more advanced technologically. They have developed those sort of plasma blasters or like plasma guns, and they're a big part of why humanity can sort of repel that alien invasion. And then straight off in the next chapter, we have people discussing those sort of historical events. Well, whether they're not sure whether they really happened or whatnot, but the story is completely shifted. That it was the Americans who had the plasma guns, and it was them who kind of bravely destroyed the alien ships. So where'd that come
History is
from?
written, well, because it's just it's kind of a reflection, I guess, of all the the lies and the fake news and the not fake news and all the stuff we've been subjected to since 2017, in terms of who decides what's real, and who do we listen to when there's so much bourgeois in the world right now that and that no one seems to be able to figure out what a fact really is. And even if they could, it doesn't really matter, because everyone, at least here in the States, there's so many people just kind of voting on their gut, or deciding that they know how to the best way to treat a virus because they believe in it in their heart instead of the science. So while at the same time trying to like play with that, like, vision or perspective of reality, I'm also trying to like write about that maybe there is none, or that there is, but we'd ignore it even if we knew what it was. So I think that's kind of where that's coming from.
I mean, I feel like, when the White House, under sort of Trump administration, when the White House spokesperson, I don't remember her name, spoke of like, well, you have your facts and we have our alternative facts. Everybody sort of from center to the left around the world kind of really made fun of that. And the longer I live, the more I see, we all have our alternative facts. And you would be hard pressed. I mean, outside of, situations where people are kind of scared to express themselves freely, you will hardly ever find someone who agrees with you on every single thing. And I think, I don't think we should look for that. And I think about how, like, when it comes to alternative history, we all have our alternative histories, both on individual level and on the national level. Was questions like was the British rule good for India, where a lot of sort of conservative English people have a very interesting take on that. And questions like, was Churchill a good guy? He has almost a myth-like sort of status in this country, but to Indians, to Bengalis, he was a war criminal. He
and
caused
what was
Bengali
Brexit
famine.
really about?
Yes, I mean, so all of that, like, and do you think that people are when it comes to the kind of retellings, and you're kind of making choices about where you want to take that history, how conscious are you of your own kind of maybe bias in storytelling, about like, where do you want to take it?
In terms of like my own understanding of the truth and facts.
Yes. So
of course I think mine is correct. I believe mine is, of course I do.
And you're my guest, so I'm bound to agree.
yeah. But I'm a student of history. I read a lot. I research a lot. I'm a former journalist. I'm a former high school teacher. So I'd like to think that I know what I'm talking about. And I do tend to research before I open my mouth. I mean, there's always a chance. And I guess, I think I had one review of my second book, 25 to Life. The guy read the dedication, and it was dedicated to everybody who wore masks when they were asked to. For COVID, everybody who wore masks without complaining, and he shut the book. Said he wrote in the review that he shut the book right after that because he, assumed or knew that I was a flaming liberal and that he wasn't going to like anything I had to say from then on out. And he's probably right. Maybe I don't know. I don't know.
Maybe he made the right judgment call for him. Yeah, I mean,
maybe he did.
But
I certainly don't want to make him angry.
I mean, I think it's interesting, isn't it, that we are so entrenched in our own opinions that we're sort of looking. I had this guest come on recently, who's a sort of expert and researcher into cults, and we were talking about how partially for social media, but we're just looking for certainty and looking for clarity where there isn't any sometimes, and for that sort of become more, I feel like we're becoming way too interested in the answers rather than the questions. Would you agree with that?
I think so. And I also think that, abandoning our belief, our incorrect or correct beliefs, means that we also leave our friends behind. There's a lot of the talk about, say, the Flat Earth Society, like, people are members of the Flat Earth Society. And even though that's been proven wrong again and again and again, they're afraid to admit that, because that means that their social group now they have to leave their social group behind, or to be shunned by their social group. So if you're a big, say Trump supporter, that's where all your buddies are. And to stop being a Trump supporter means that you have to find a new group of friends. It's kind of like leaving Twitter or leaving X. That was, no matter how bad that got, that was where your pals were. So, leaving it and going to this new wild world of social media, the search is difficult. It's you want to know where you are, you want to know where your feet are, and we're very uncomfortable if we don't know where we're standing, I guess.
I mean, definitely creates like this sense of impermanence of connection and this lack of trust between people, because obviously, like I said, like I have friends who I agree and disagree with on every single subject under the sun, and that's that's a place I want to be. Like I want to be surrounded by people who I don't necessarily agree with, because they kind of keep me in check.
Well, I think doubt is a very powerful place to exist in. If you there's things that I believe, but there's things that I'm open to. I mean, if you are, I'm not gonna agree with you if you think trans people shouldn't exist. I'm not gonna agree with you if you think, LGBTQ people should be put in a camp. We're not gonna get along on that. But if you want to believe in God, all right, that's cool. I'm open to a conversation about that. If you think that socialized medicine is not the way forward, all right, we can talk about that.
I think there's not that many people, in fact, who actually deep down believe in absolutes. I think we're pushing people into those categories. I think it's, I mean, for me, it's definitely when I see people have can't even call it a conversation online, it's easiest to create this imaginary argument when you imagine like a whole line of argumentation from the other side that doesn't actually exist, I think sometimes. And I think, you kind of push people in this like, oh, if you don't agree 100% on this subject, then that means that you must believe 100% on the other side. And I think that creates a very dangerous situation. And when we talk about alternative histories, and when we think about, like the stuff that I was taught in Poland, right? Because I grew up in Poland, and there's definitely a sort of national complex about how Poland was treated around, around World War II, around like post-war. And Polish people felt very betrayed, right? So the way they viewed the sort of pact between Churchill and Stalin, and was that it was, and obviously Roosevelt, it was that they stabbed Poland in the back. Like, Polish pilots helped defend Great Britain during, during the war, and here you betray us and you give us over to Stalin, right? And that is how I was taught. We actually like are taught like a phrase like, well, that was like the stab in the back, in history classes. And we were taught it as if we had any alternative. Whereas the way people are taught here is that we literally had no choice. We had nothing left. Great Britain was like completely like, rubble dust, no money, nothing. And, they were invited to the table as a courtesy. It was like, it was not, nobody was going to go to war with Stalin over Poland,
right.
Which is a far more nuanced and understandable take. But I think obviously from the other side, it's like an absolute. This was the kind of the evil thing. And the thing that really interests me in alternative history is because we have this butterfly effect, right? So it's like, if Kennedy hadn't been assassinated, what would happen? And I think if you ask 5 different historians, they would have a completely different answer for you.
No, I agree. I quite agree. I think, if I was recently at the LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson Presidential Library down in Austin, Texas, and he became president after Kennedy was assassinated. So you look at his record of getting things done, and then you think about, how he was able to do that because he was such a skilled politician. Then you look at Kennedy, who was spending, so much of his time philandering. Is that did maybe being assassinated save Kennedy from a Bill Clinton level scandal? That would have been interesting. I've heard that theory before. Um, but yeah, I mean, but the nice thing about doing the science fiction is that I can drop a space travel and aliens in without causing too much trouble and having to answer to too many historians, because it didn't happen, and no one's gonna. Well, most people are not gonna think that it did. I think um, I could be wrong.
But I can see that
Open
you have like a level of dedication to your craft, but you do
mm.
ask yourself those questions. And from
Mm-hmm.
a sort of storyteller's perspective, obviously a lot more work goes on behind the scenes than what
Mm-hmm.
we see on the page. And just to give
Mm-hmm.
that kind of like nice atmosphere that you create, like you must have done a ton of research. So can you tell us what it was?
Yeah, I did a fair amount of research. I mean, like I said, I lived through the '70s firsthand, but I was kind of young, so I was able to look back at like old pictures to kind of get a sense of what things looked like. And I did a fair amount of research on the music, and I did a fair amount of research on the politicians of the day, and I did. I looked at. I actually, for the first time, I wrote from photo images. So I went and like looked at New York back in the '70s, and I had images of what like a room looked like and what like a street looked like, and so I was able to kind of write from those images, which is not something I usually do. So I think that kind of helped me capture the color, the tint, kind of that. I think of the '70s was kind of a yellow tint for some reason. I'm not sure. So I was able to kind of put that
All
tint in
the
there.
photographs were kind of like the
Yeah,
photography was using like I think different just different technology
I think
like
so.
in the paper, not the
Yeah,
photographs themselves, in the paper.
that's
So
probably where that's coming from. But I think I was able to, that's what the kind of the research I did, and then it was just a matter of kind of like thinking about like, all right, so what would be different if, and some things I'm sure I get right, and some things I'm sure I get wrong. Um,
I mean, you
but
can't, you're reimagining a history, like, it's not
yeah.
about like right or wrong, it's about like your choices, and I'm interested in
Mhm.
what choices you made here and like why you made them.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you think about, you just look at people, and what would people do if they knew that that aliens were a certainty, that we were not alone? I think everybody would go a little crazy, right? I
Mm.
think it would be a fundamental change in our understanding of ourselves. It would probably change religion. It would probably change, and if we had, Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev had a conversation late toward the end of the Cold War, where Reagan asked Gorbachev that if the U.S. was ever invaded by aliens, if the Russians would come to help us out, and Gorbachev said they would. So that was kind of also in my mind when I wrote this, and the idea
That's a
that
low risk commitment.
I know. I thought it was very funny, but I used it in the idea that in the book, there wasn't a Cold War, or there was a Cold War, but only until the aliens showed up, and then the USSR and the USA decided to kind of like work together to
Mm.
kind of create with China to kind of create this defense for the world. So I thought about like what would that look like, and if there was no Vietnam, then no Vietnam conflict, or what would that look like? I assumed that the Korean War would still exist because that was early enough. But, instead of the Vietnam War, we had, you could get drafted and be sent to the moon to watch out for aliens and things like that. So that's kind of where I went from, is just extrapolated, um, and thought about like, what would it change? What would it change to have a little better technology? What would it change if the taxes were being used in a different way? What would it change if Nixon had passed his universal basic income plan, because it did get passed in the book. And people were able to live on that, small life, but they were able to live on that if they had to. I thought about the music, and what the music was, because the story goes from, it starts in like 1950 to 61 to 76, and then the next book is 20 years after that, so it's 1999. So, all right, so when Pearl Jam was upset with Ticketmaster, would they be upset on Earth, or would they go to the moon to avoid, I thought, yeah, I could see Eddie Vedder going to the moon to avoid, the big business and do his art. So there are all kinds of things that I kind of like thought about and wondered about. And I think, everything from movies to, the Mercury Rising, the movie that Brooklyn's talking about in the beginning of the first book there, in my vision, it replaced Star Wars. There was no Star Wars. It didn't need to be Star Wars, because they just made up, they made up a fictionalized version of an actual conflict, and that was the big budget feature of that summer. So, I don't know. What would it change? What would it change?
A lot of change in the sort of popular culture, then.
Yeah, a lot of change in popular culture. There's another, I don't know if you've seen For All Mankind on Apple TV. The idea is a science fiction series. The idea there is the Russians got to the moon first, and they won the space race, and what it did to, American culture, American pride, and, there's all kinds of things that happen. It's pretty good science fiction, actually. It really kind of, it goes and talks about what the politics might have changed, and the Equal Rights Amendment actually got passed, and all kinds of things happened. But it also changed Star Trek, because Star Trek, if we're actually going into space on our own, do we need shows about it, or do we need like a soap opera in space instead? It's just it's interesting to think about and play with those ideas.
It is. Going back to the sort of main kind of conflict, right? As in like the aliens as a thing. So like, without being too sort of spoilery perhaps, but I was thinking about how you have restructured the way the world works in your novels by giving them this foreign attacker. And I feel like humans always like want this like big dramatic external enemy, external threat, even though we are all like, we're all facing the climate change as a threat to us all, and yet you don't see this similar sort of banding together. So what is it, do you think, about this kind of concept of an alien that would have the power to unite people together?
I think if we could, I think it's the short, sharp shock. Climate change is kind of the equivalent of, putting the frog in water and heating it up slowly. And now we're almost at the boiling point, and the frog is starting to thrash now. If we had dumped the frog into a boiling pot of water, I think we would have reacted much quicker. It's kind of like COVID. COVID, if in order to us to have done the right thing by COVID, I think more people would have had to die. You know what I mean? We need to have that like big impact in order to take it seriously. And because we've been talking about climate change since Soylent Green came out in 1971. We've been talking about climate change for 50 years now, and it's only now that that we're really kind of looking around, where there's like hurricane force winds in California, and heat domes in Europe, and all kinds of things.
But those are like disastrous events. Like those are absolute disastrous events, and like there's this drive for adapt. Like humans are just so adaptable, and that will be the end of us, I think, because the fact that in California, you have the wildfire season, and then on the other side you have a hurricane season. Like, why are we normalizing this wildfire season? But it's just bizarre, isn't it? And
it is a very strange idea. Yeah, if we just accept it. Yeah,
it's just like, oh yes,
season.
We all might die. It's fine,
Right.
Comes around every May.
Well, we already kind of like have the snowbirds who, like, you know, they summer in the north and they winter in the south. And I can imagine we might have people who are firebirds who, you know, they spend the fire season, the wildfire season, you know, away from the wildfire areas and then go back to the wildfire areas for the rest of it. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And you know, as far as climate change goes, there's been some interesting things happening with, like after Hurricane, was it Ida? I can't remember the one that hit New York and New Jersey pretty hard. There were actually some communities that sold all their lands to the government and then moved their entire community, leaving their community behind as kind of a watershed, water absorption area. So there's been a little bit of that happening. You know, I had this idea that eventually we're going to give up on New Orleans because we have to keep repairing New Orleans every time it floods. That eventually it's going to be there's not enough money to rebuild it again. You know, so when New Orleans is either going to have to move north or shut down. You know, I've got a, my second book there, 25 to Life. You know, has Texas seceding and the desertification of like the American Southwest and um, you know, there's just all kinds of things that, since we've kept kicking the can down the road so far, our solutions are going to have to be particularly draconian, I think. Um, but that's just my prediction.
Or maybe we'll just come up with a way to sort of retell it as a different kind of story, because I think what stops a lot of people from doing anything about climate change is that the narrative is it's your fault. And when you kind of,
Mm-hmm.
you see that also quite explicitly, it's not like individual citizens' fault. Like, you know, the whole concept of carbon footprint, right? It was
Mm-hmm.
invented in order to shift the blame. It's like, you know, oh, don't look over here. Don't look at, you know, those companies that are producing all of those emissions. Like, have you recycled?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
If you have not, then you're the problem. Yeah.
and I think that narrative for people to actually truly feel angry, because you know how long can you sort of feel perpetually angry at yourself? Like, I feel like the narrative will have to shift quite dramatically to create this, put a face on the problem, and to really
Mm-hmm.
sort of drill down that this is this enemy that we have to kind of push against.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what's going to do that is going to be climate refugees. You know, we're already seeing, you know, by 2035, there's going to be 1 billion climate refugees in the world trying to find a new place to live. And, you know, my fear is that instead of, you know, doing the right thing, handling it the right way, we're going to become more isolationist. You know, build the wall, put up the fence, you know, even though, you know, I've got this theory that, you know, immigration is basically decolonization. You know, we took all their stuff and now they want it back, so they should be able to move to America, I think, and Europe, I think, because you know we went in and we destroyed their ecosystem and we destroyed their government and culture, and now we're gonna, you know, put a wall up and say, well, you know, it's like the British Museum. You know, you can't have your art back. You know, we're gonna hang on to it. You can't have your money or your resources back. We're gonna hang on to it, and you can go out and starve outside.
Yeah, I
So.
mean, I just went to British Museum. It's a bit of a non sequitur, but I went to British Museum the other day with my kids' sort of school trip, and it was interesting. You just walk into this hall, and there's like, oh, the Parthenon,
Mm-hmm.
like just most of it.
Yep.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, it's perfectly normal, and you just
It's.
move on. And then, but I have to say that it's interesting when we're talking about alternative narratives.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole section in the British Museum of legally acquired. This is not like the Parthenon situation. We're talking legally acquired historical pottery artifacts from China. And you
Mm-hmm.
have examples of Chinese pottery dating back like 3,000 years from all over China. And those were collectors who bought it before the Cultural Revolution, right? And they, at the time when those things were acquired, there were many of them throughout China. Now, during Cultural Revolution, many of those sort of styles were completely destroyed intentionally. And when I went to see that exhibition with a friend, she was talking because so she's Chinese, and she was chatting with a group of university students from China, and like the whole exhibition was filled with Chinese students who specialize in art, you know, who study art, who study pottery, all that, who came to the UK to look at all of those examples of their own culture, but they didn't blame the British Museum for having it. They were like, we kind of destroyed all of it back home, so we're glad that we get to see this. But obviously that's a different situation to Parthenon. I'm not implying that Parthenon should remain in the UK. But it's interesting because you know, whatever subject you touch, there will be the well, not even alternative, there'll be the other point of view that you know, you that has a point to it.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, what's going to happen if, you know, we ever do have to migrate to Mars, and, you know, the art, you know, whatever art can fit on the ship is going to go there, and whatever art can't, aren't we going to be grateful if, you know, Elon Musk decides to take some Chinese pottery with him because it'll be the only Chinese pottery left, or, you know, otherwise it won't make it, you know. So it's about, like, you know, but I think the question
that's only if you believe that, that's only if you believe the narrative that humanity's future is out there in space.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I mean, I'd love to think it. I really hoped I'd be living in space by now, but I don't, you know, thinking about all the problems and the difficulties, I'm not seeing it happen for a long, long time, if ever.
Yeah. So sort of moving towards space and the science fiction elements, I feel like there is something so fascinating for humans about exploring space, even though there's like parts of our own world that we don't know much about, like, you know, the really deep ocean level. We don't know that much about it, and yet there's this sense of like extreme version of escapism in space travel. Like, what do you think the main appeal of it is? What drew you to it?
What drew me to it? I think it's just, I mean, I think it's the same reason that kids dig holes in the ground. You know, if you've ever seen a kid and put them out in the backyard, they're going to dig a hole just to see what's down there. I think a lot of it is just like wondering what is beyond what you can see. And there's really, I mean, the ocean's really big, and we have not explored the entire ocean. So, but we're always still looking. And, you know, there's really nothing bigger than space. So what's out there? You know, what could be out there? What's hiding out there? I think, you know, it's because we can see it, but we can't touch it. I think that's the big mystery. And I think, you know, since there have been people, they've kind of looked up and they looked at the lights and said, you know, what is this? And, you know, we tried to explain it with religion, and then we tried to figure it out with science. And, you know, now we're realizing that, you know, it's going to take a lot of work to kind of get there, but we're still sending probes out and still trying to figure it out. And for some people, maybe it doesn't matter. You know, maybe they're not interested in finding out, you know, what's in the dark or what's in the hole. But I think for most people, at least at one point in their life, they do wonder, and some people just never stop. And I think that's where the escapism come from, because some people never stop, and I've never stopped wondering. Even though, you know, I'm pretty sure that, you know, we're alone in this solar system, and that, you know, Mars is not going to be a great place to live. You know, I still like, you know, what if, you know, maybe, sure, you know, who knows? Yeah. What do you think?
I mean, I kind of think about how we look to science for answers to problems that sometimes for problems that we're unwilling to solve ourselves. Sometimes we already have like part of the answer and we're not willing to act on it, sort of like with climate change. But I think people often put like there's this juxtaposition in people's minds between religion, spiritual belief, and socially sort of, even when you move away from religion, there's the social narratives that we believe in almost as quasi-religions, like depending on which sort of political group you're in, which sort of social circle you're in, you will have those kind of quasi-religious sets of beliefs. And then we kind of juxtapose it with science on the other hand, even though to like as a source of objective clarity, perhaps. And I feel like, again, to me, science is about asking questions. And it's like science is always science as we know it now, or like science as we understand it now. And there's this constant development, there's like only like the other week, scientists have sort of found a galaxy, sort of a cluster of galaxies that was sort of circular in nature, and it defies our current understanding of the laws of gravity and kind of, and how objects sort of interact with each other in space. And you have this sort of very circular sort of cluster of many sort of thousands of galaxies, and scientists don't know how to explain it. And it's interesting because, when you're talking science fiction, you always imagine science being a little bit more advanced. So what do you like ask, like, so what questions do you ask about the science that hasn't been in the point of your novel? Like, they have more answers than we do, but they still have some answers that are questions that are unanswered.
Well, I mean, there's a difference between what they call like hard science fiction and soft science fiction or science fantasy, So, if I write about the space station, the ISS and the Soyuz and the space shuttle and that kind of stuff, that stuff we've got, that's hard science. And I can write, I mean, I think I could do a murder mystery on the ISS, or I could do, something like that. But when in order to spice things up a little bit, you have to add warp drive or something, or you have to be able to get to Mars quicker than 30 days, or so then you have to like, hand wave a little bit and say, all right, we've got this, or, we can do this. And, maybe we can someday, but maybe we can't someday. And so you've got to like assume that science has found a way beyond these problems we've got. And whether or not that's true, or whether or not it's a viable alternative, I think is where you kind of get between science fiction and say science fantasy. I mean, I think Mercury rising and Earth retrograde, I'd call them science fantasy, because it's not stuff that I think is ever really going to happen. I don't think it's not going to happen. The first book I wrote, The Light Years, is set, 1,000 years from now, far away after the Earth has been like abandoned. That's probably science fantasy. The second book, which is kind of climate fiction, I think that's science fiction, because it's all about like what everything in it is something that we could have. I've just taken it and kind of extrapolated how far it might go. So I think that might answer your question. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, interestingly, like between looking at like the sort of slightly different style of your books, I guess it's that when sort of bringing it back to science. So in your first book, it's let me rewind. So basically, like, no matter the tech, we're still humans, right? And so like a good novel will always sort of bring it back to something quite universally like human, or some kind of like, how would humans react in these conditions? And in your first book, they are reacting to the sort of new challenges by kind of the scientific advance of sort of almost time travel. It's like space travel, but you're traveling through time, and how do people form connections through this time? Whereas now when you're kind of talking sort of science, we have some of this science, right? Not the plasma blasters maybe,
right,
and
right.
we can't quite travel to Mars in a day yet, but we do have there's a lot more familiar in this book. And I found it interesting how you kind of went in this direction with the science. So obviously we have a lot of scientific advances now that are challenging our understanding of like how things should work in terms of sort of development of AI and how we're using that and what the purpose of it is. And we're creating a lot of different things that we don't quite understand the purpose of yet.
Yeah, AI in some ways is kind of a solution in search of a problem. Maybe, I mean, at least the way, it's not and I try not to use AI because it's not really like ChatGPT is not a true AI. It's just generative, a generative algorithm basically, as opposed to like, creating a robot or a brain that can act just like us or think like us, or, and if we could create a program like that, there's no way we could probably control it. So it's interesting where we are because we didn't think that this was where we're going to be at this point. We thought we'd have our jetpack. We thought we'd have our, our self-driving car and maybe our space or maybe our personal helicopter or whatever. We'd have a robot that would do our dishes, that would clean our house. I don't think we anticipated that we'd have a robot that would write our poetry.
And I mean, that was like part of science fiction, but from the point, the kind of moral conundrum of what if they were just like us, if the AI robots were just like us, really, in all the ways that we think matter. But I think so. I think that the difference I'm sort of getting at is the difference in looking at science in terms of functionality rather than at science in terms of moral values or like how society operates.
Okay.
So when you're talking about AI that writes poetry, for example, right? That is not a functional need that AI is met.
Right. Because we already have things to write poetry.
Yes.
But it also kind of begs the question. I mean, we're very precious about ourselves too. We're very precious about our place in the world, and we this idea that we have souls and there's some kind of creative spark within us. But it's entirely possible we're just algorithms that are putting letters together in a way that seems like they're the likely way to fit. So it's entirely possible that what we think is our vaunted creativity and our vaunted intelligence is really not as cool as we thought it was. Maybe it is just a biological chemical algorithm running, putting these little patterns together in a way that looks pretty. I think the oceans make art by turning driftwood. Random forces make beautiful things.
I mean, but when you're talking about conscious art, there's other animals that create conscious art consciously. There's loads of evidence of like, I've seen like an elephant draw a picture, there's
octopi and
chimpanzees created in works of art. There's a fish that creates aesthetically pleasing patterns on the ocean floor, and we can't figure out why it does it. It attracts a female via the medium of this beautiful art installation that is
so maybe it's fish calligraphy,
as temporary as a Tibetan mandala, and yet something about it is pleasing. And I think, in terms of, it's just like a fight for survival. I think for me, like, it's not so much about like what makes us special when it comes to AI. I think for me, it's like, we know that we need this ability to express ourselves, to be happy, to function, this is, and everybody does it to an extent. And I feel like it's also this thing that we aspire to. And I think we're pushing ourselves out of the aspirational spots.
I can see that. I can see that. But and my fear is that, AI is, and I played around with it a little bit with some of these Bard in the chat, just to see what it would do. I'm a college professor, so I'm always looking to see if students are using it and writing their essays with it. And I fooled around with it enough to know that an essay written by an AI is good enough. I would give it a C. I would probably give it a C at this level. And it can write. I fooled around with it in terms of like writing stuff. And on my blog, I posted a sample of its writing and a sample of mine, and asked people to decide which one had a pulse, which writer had a pulse. And it was 50-50, which maybe says more about my writing than its. But I think
it's not great for one's vanity, I'm sure.
Right. But I think there's a certain segment of the population who are not looking for art. They're looking for entertainment and content. And if it's good enough to, make them happy, then I think that's when it becomes kind of dangerous to our livelihoods. If 97% of the people are happy with an AI written script, then that's where the way the studios are going to go.
Of course, yeah. I think that is it's interesting also because when people think about obsolescence, of certain jobs, they always sort of are okay with obsolescence of other people's jobs. And there's so much of that when technology goes forward, and we consume differently. My mom was telling me about how when she was a young girl, there was still a job of a woman who fixed stockings, like who would fix leather in stockings.
Okay.
And there was a special machine for it. And, because stockings were expensive. And now you buy a £3 pair and when it lathers, you chuck it.
You chuck it, yeah.
And, but nobody, especially, exactly cried for those, for those women who lost a highly specialized technical job. And now when we look at AI and the positive sort of sides, when we think positive sides of AI, right? Like, for example, there's been research done about putting AI alongside judges, feeding them raw data, nothing else about people who are asking for bail. And if they outperform judges when it comes to like how right the choices made by the computer were, they outperform judges by a factor of like 400. Like it was really astounding. Like, whereas the judges who technically had more information, they had all the non-verbal cues, they had, they could look the defendant in the eye and decide whether or not, this person was going to, run for it if allowed to go on bail, or whether or not they were a danger to society or not. And a computer with nothing else but raw data could make those decisions much quicker. And, obviously, for the general public, you look at this and you think, okay, well, judges are obsolete. Right?
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe.
But without looking at the dangers of it. And I think for people, like you, who sort of focus on science in the kind of, in your storytelling, those questions of like, oh, but what about the danger of it?
Yeah.
Is the thing that might be more interesting. I mean, I don't know if you would agree with that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think a lot of what science fiction writers do is they look forward to see what is possibly going to go wrong with this. Because I guess not only is that more interesting to find out what's going to go wrong, but it also is important to think about. It's easy to just kind of like let it happen, but you need someone out there, sounding the Jeremiad, and I think that's the literature, the imagination, and that's the job of the science fiction writer, I think.
And the constant vigilance of it.
Constant vigilance, yeah.
So aside from the kind of being a warning bell of literature,
Mm.
do you think that there is a comfort that's unique to the genre of science fiction in terms of maybe imaginary clarity in the future? Or
I think there is, because I think it's a very hopeful genre, because it intuits or assumes that we're going to make it. That we're going to make it.
yeah,
1,000 years from now, and still maybe we'll have the same problems and be carrying the same baggage, but at least we'll get that far. And that kind of flies in the face of a lot of evidence. We could have bombed ourselves into submission and death back in the 80s. We still could. Now we're dealing with a climate change. There could be, COVID taught us that we could wipe ourselves out with a pandemic. But science fiction is always saying that, well, we're going to be okay. We're going to
yeah.
make it at least
Like
far enough to
we'll
have
get
more
over the
problems.
problems of today somehow,
Yeah,
and then
somehow.
we will have invented new problems in the future.
We'll have different problems, but at least we'll still be there. So I think there's
Yes.
an inherent optimism in the genre.
And that is a great place to sort of end the interview on this optimistic note. Just before we go, I just want to ask you, what's next?
Like I said, I've got a book on submission right now, which is another science fiction standalone, and I'm working on a novella, which is I think I'll be done with at least a good first draft of that by Friday.
Oh,
And after that, something else. I guess we'll see. It's
I look.
harder. I think
Hmm?
no, it's just hard. It's harder to stay published than to get published, I find. So I think that's
Yes.
the big struggle now, is keeping your name out there. I mean, as we talked about it, it's hard as hell to get that first book, but the second, third, fourth are probably even tougher. So
Yes, it's not something that people talk about a lot outside of
mm,
publishing, is it?
right, very much so.
Well, thank you so much for joining me for this interview, Rob. And
Yeah, it was good to see you. I missed your voice and missed talking to you. So I'm glad we were able to hook up like this.
thank you. Thank you for watching the video. Click like and subscribe if you would like more. It really helps the channel. Thank you and see you next week.